Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss again here at allpointstv.com. We are glad to have you here at the studio and also WFOV, and that's 92.1, and we are on that particular station in network on Saturday at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. I want to thank Mr. Paul Herring over there, and also want to thank the Odyssey House who sponsors the programming. We are very appreciative of having you aboard and having you as our partners. We are coming together today on the 21st of January 2019, and if Dr. King were alive, since we're celebrating on the third Monday, every January, the third Monday, as of 1986, we have been celebrating the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King on the third Monday, although Dr. King was born on the 15th of January 1929. The celebration of his birthday, which was placed into the legal arena in 1983 with the idea that it'll be 3 years later when we'd actually celebrate the birth of this great man who had a dream in 1963 in August, on the 28th of that month, when he gave his I Have a Dream speech, which was, I think, the third time that speech had been given. One time down in Detroit, and I think another time in Birmingham, and then by the time he had gotten to Washington in the march called the March on Washington, although you had a number of marches on Washington, this March on Washington, which attracted 250,000 people, and Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech. At that time, he had kind of fine-tuned it and got the kinks out of it. And people don't know this, but Dr. King had not even intended to give that speech at that time. And the speech he had prepared, because Dr. King was a Christian minister, and they don't actually start getting into the flow of the speech until they get away from their text. The text is written, quite frankly, only as a way of getting them into the aura of what they're trying to say. And when they move away from the text, that's when they really start going to town. And I remember reading about Clarence Jones, who was Dr. King's attorney, who was watching King on that day in August. And he saw King, who started off his speech saying, 5 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic image we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And Dr. King went ahead with his prepared text for about 5 minutes. And then Clarence Jones says he then saw Dr. King push the text away. And he wrote later on and said he thought, now we're getting ready to go to town. And you see, and if you listen to that speech very carefully, you can see, or rather you can hear, the transition that Dr. King made when he moved from the prepared text to the speech he had given on 2 other occasions. And the transition words were, despite the difficulty of the moment, I still have a dream. And people did not know that Dr. King was moving away from the text he had prepared. I think he might have been up to 3 o'clock that morning working on the text, and had not finalized it until around 3:30, 4 o'clock that morning. And he switched over from the prepared text, and you could hear it in the speech if you listen very carefully, where Dr. King said, despite the difficulty of the moment, I still have a dream. And he transitions over to the I Have a Dream speech. In John Lewis's book, which is called Walking with the Wind, John Lewis, who was on the stage as a representative of the organization called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, John Lewis wrote in the book, Walking with the Wind, that Mahalia Jackson, who was the gospel singer that was pretty much the songstress for the civil rights movement, leaned into Dr. King, probably picking up that his prepared text wasn't working, and leaned into Dr. King, got closer to him to whisper Dr. King, tell him about the dream. And that's when Dr. King pushed his text away and then transitioned into, and despite the difficulty of the moment, I still have a dream. And he went on for another 13 minutes with I have a dream speech. Many people think that he started off with I have a dream. But if you go listen to the told speech, you'll see that he started off talking about the 100 years before that moment, Abraham Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which had been signed in 1863, January the 1st of that year. And Dr. King had called for the March on Washington in August of 1963, 100 years later. It has a lot of different things to it. So as you're celebrating Dr. King today, and there'll be no doubt having Dr. King with his greatest oration, I Have a Dream, understand some of the history and back of it, even to the point where the March on Washington was not a new idea in terms of the civil rights movement. It had been proposed 22 years earlier in 1941 by Asa Philip Randolph, who was the union head of the sleeping car porters and maids union that had been set up in 1925. And Asa Philip Randolph had the idea of having a march on Washington to push the integration of the armed services in 1941. We were just about on the brink of getting into the war. Pearl Harbor had not happened yet. Pearl Harbor would happen on December the 7th of that year, but we were edging ourselves into World War II. And given the fact that we were kind of indirectly and unofficially in the war behind the scenes, we had not declared ourselves in the war. That would happen after Pearl Harbor had been bombed on the 7th of December of 1941. And of course, Roosevelt would ask for the declaration of war in reaction and response to it on December the 8th of that year. But Randolph is making a threat to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and telling him that they are going to bring 100,000 persons to Washington to demand that the federal government act upon the integration of the services and also upon the jobs in the country to be more fairly distributed among the population. And so Randolph was sitting there talking. Another person at the table was the representative from the NAACP, Walter White. We forgot these names here, but Walter White, who could pass for a white man. And of course, a lot of persons I know when Du Bois got mad at him one time, he called him a white man because he had blue eyes, he had blonde hair, and so on. In fact, Walter White had oftentimes gone to Klan rallies undercover, and they could not detect that he had infiltrated the Klan because his phenotype was you could not. Randolph called not Randolph. Roy Wilkins. Roy Wilkins called him white when they would have arguments inside of the NAACP. Asa Philip Randolph was the one that conjured up the idea of having a march on Washington in 1941. And he was, my idea of black and white is that those are opposite colors. And if you have to tell me that you are black and I cannot detect it in your phenotype, you're not black. And sometimes when you call yourself black, and your phenotype might reconcile with that. That doesn't necessarily follow either, because that's only the way it's looked at maybe in the United States. But in other parts of the world, you'll find even the phenotype is black. It's not necessarily the final verdict on the identity, because a lot of other factors come into play. For example, in Latin America, you are black or white based upon your income. So it's not just one thing. Is what I'm saying, folks. And I've been in Africa, and I'll tell you that that's also true in many countries in Africa, where you can go around here talking about black this and black that, and your coloring is black, and you're not that based upon some distinguishing characteristic different from just the phenotype. So you have to kind of understand that. But Walter White was in the organization, and because he could in fact pass, And if you can pass, then that if you can pass for white, I don't know how you can pass for white in the way we look at it over here, and then you be black. Or let me put it a different way with Obama, because I like to get on that case every once in a while. Just because you say that you're black and you claim your American citizenship because you're black, Obama would be black only because of the declaration of that. But to be a black American, that's impossible. And so it's a lot of things here. But go back to what I'm saying here about the March on Washington. It did not start with the great Martin Luther King. King had the idea of the March on Washington, but the idea predates Dr. King's involvement in the civil rights movement. It goes back at least in that particular genre of the civil rights movement, because we've had a civil rights movement ever since blacks arrived here in 1619. But Dr. King picked up the energy of the March on Washington from Asa Philip Randolph, and Randolph was the one that said we ought to do what had been threatened in 41. They never pulled it off, but the idea was, let's have a March on Washington, and this time it will be for jobs and freedom. Now, that if you look at those signs on the 28th of August, you'll see those signs saying they're marching for jobs and freedom. That was Randolph's involvement in it. And in fact, they'll have Randolph as the master of ceremonies because they are paying homage to Randolph's role in terms of conjuring up the idea. He introduces all the speakers that day. You hear that in the tape, and hear that in the tape of the March on Washington as well. And then, given the fact that Montgomery, Alabama, had launched the civil rights campaign and career of this minister that had come out of Atlanta by way of Boston University, the same school, by the way, that has fostered Ocasio-Cortez, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the representative from the 14th District in New York. That school is where Dr. King got his PhD degree. So Atlanta through Boston University, and from Boston University coming into Montgomery and taking the place of the Reverend Stokes, who was the pastor there that had gotten the people in that particular church ready for Dr. King, because Stokes was a radical pastor there in Montgomery, but too radical for the congregation. But by him being more radical than King, when King comes in, he's not so bad. But they got rid of Stokes because Stokes was always getting the church in trouble. So King comes in, and in 1955, had just arrived in Montgomery. He had gotten his, he was working on his dissertation, and would finally get his PhD from Boston in 1956. The bus boycott, if you recall, would have occurred on December the 1st. The arrest of Rosa Parks would have occurred on December the 1st, 1955, and the bus boycott would have occurred 4 days later on the 5th of that month, December the 5th, 1955. And now Dr. King is being launched onto the stage. A lot of things going on there in Montgomery, but out of it comes Dr. King's leadership. And for the next 13 years, King is on the national and international stage as a leader of the civil rights movement. But there are a lot of little extending circumstances that you have to understand in order to really appreciate the moment. Okay, so I tried to figure out before we got on the air today, how old would King be if he were alive today? As I said earlier, Dr. King was born on the 15th of January, 1929. So I did some math here just to kind of see what would be the age of Dr. King today if he were still alive. And it's hard to imagine Dr. King being 90 years old. If he was still alive today, Dr. King would be in his 90th year. But because he is frozen in time, because of his death on April the 4th, 1968, Dr. King will always be 39 years old in history, because he was struck down in Memphis, Tennessee, on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel, April the 4th, 1968, at 6 o'clock Eastern Standard Time in the evening. And I can remember that day so well in terms of what was I doing at the time when the news broke that Dr. King had been struck down by an assassin's bullet. That time period is etched in my mind just as much as etched in my mind was the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
By the way, we do have I just logged into chat there on YouTube, and you have a comment of somebody, Dylan Robinson, said a nice informational show. So somebody's commenting on your show right now.
Dylan Robinson does our program?
No. So it's Dylan Robinson. So you might want to know that.
Okay,
yeah.
I'm glad. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. We don't get a lot of compliments on our show because we're so good. Most persons are throwing missiles at us.
I was like, well, a lot of people like you, but they're like, I've heard people tell me, they said, I like Mr. Moss, I respect him because he was an educator, but, and then they go on why they disagree with you. So, but it's like, it's interesting.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate the callers. We don't get a lot of calls coming in, and of course we would appreciate anyone that.
This was a chat comment, somebody typed it in.
That comes into play. But Randolph was a pivotal member of the movement. And we don't always go back and collect all of the pieces here. We too much seem to be focusing on one person, as if one person can get all the work that has to be done. I'll tell you a question that I raised when I talk about King. I raised a question. I raised a question, John, that's raised by Aaron Magruder, the one that did Boondocks. And I don't know if you remember that series that was done by this young man that did a series, one of which was Dr. King waking up from a coma. And here's Dr. King in a coma all these years, and he wakes up and to find the people that were in the condition that they're in right now. And what Magruder is doing in that particular segment of Boondocks, he is raising a question of what if King came back and saw, as Magruder said, the condition of his people in the aftermath of his death. Let's say he wakes up and he comes back and he sees the condition. Magruder has the blacks out on the dance floor, and they got King at the microphone trying to get their attention. And he says, brothers and sisters, and they're out there doing the slop and doing the fly and the mashed potatoes, and they can't get their attention. And all of a sudden, Magruder has King saying, will you, and he used the N-word, will you, the N-word, please shut up and pay attention. And then the people on the dance floor stop because they're surprised and shocked to hear King use that word. And they say, did he say what we think he said? And Dr. King is trying to talk to them, and they won't listen and things of that sort because it's a different era than it was then. And he has Dr. King at the end of that presentation. He has Dr. King saying, I think I'm going to Canada. And I'll tell you what that raises. It's a question I raise a lot of times when I'm talking about King, because we can talk about Dr. King until the cows come home as a timepiece back in 1968 and then 13 years before that in 1955. But the question that's raised by Magruder, and I also raise it when I'm having discussions about this, is what if Dr. King was so prescient about the future, and he's aware of how this drama that he was involved in and willing to risk his life over, and he's able to look down through the years of history, 13 years beyond the point of his death, and because he dies 13 years after he stands up on the stage of the civil rights movement, and he sees where this movement leads to and the condition of blacks, let's say today in 2019. The question is this: if King could look down through the ages of history and see how this drama ends up, is King on that balcony of the Lorraine Hotel on April the 4th, 1968? Is King the day before on April the 3rd, 1968, speaking in front of 2,000 people when he gave his mountaintop speech? where he says, some began to talk about the threats that were out from some of our sick white brothers about what would happen to me now. He gets into his talk, which was a long speech, but he had learned how to close his speeches up, energizing the audience before he sits down. He had learned that over the 13 years, because when he did that in 1955, they told Dr. King, you didn't end it the right way in terms of inspiring the people. He would give what he had to say and then sit down, but you had to say something at the end, get people, out of their seats, because they had to go out there and face those dogs, face Bull Connor, Sheriff Clark. So King ends his speech on a note. We all know the ending of the speech, but Dr. King was talking about the threats that were out, and in fact, when he was flying into Memphis, they had to get everybody off the plane because there were bomb threats. And that's what King is talking about when he says in that speech that some began to talk about the threats that were out, because they had to get off the plane, they had to search the plane. The pilot announced, ladies and gentlemen, we have Dr. King on board. And we are going to have the plane searched. And so they did that. It was delayed by an hour or so. By the time the King had gotten into Memphis, Dr. King was very tired because he had, and he was so tired, in fact, he had sent Ralph Abernathy to take his place. And, of course, Jesse Jackson was very happy to take Dr. King's place. They'd been worrying Dr. King about getting his place in the sun. King and Jesse didn't get along, by the way. But King kept telling Jesse that just leave me alone, because Jesse kept telling King, when do I get my chance? So when King does not go to speak at that night, April the 3rd, to give his mountaintop speech, Jesse was very glad to go down there. But when they got there, Ralph Abernathy, Jesse Jackson, I don't know if Jose Williams was there. I don't know if Bevel was there. But these were Andy Young. These are some of the inner circle members of the SCLC. And when they got there, when they walked in, the people thought that, well, Jesse's coming first, and there's Ralph, and they thought King was in back of them. And when they walked in there and saw that they didn't have King with them, then Ralph Abernathy, these Christian pastors can feel the audience. That's something you have to be able to feel, that sometimes the speech is not working. And that's what I was saying earlier about King. King picked up that speech he had written out the night before, and they finished about 4 o'clock that morning. That speech it wasn't getting it. And King was supposed to be the climatic speaker on that day, August 28th, 1963, and what he had written out was not working, because Christian pastors don't get off like that. They might, if you notice them in the pulpit, they will start off on a text. And my father was a pastor, so I watched him a lot of times. And my father was a great pastor, by the way, down in Detroit. He's dead now. But I used to watch him in these revivals. And I asked him one day, when I was a little child, I asked him, because I said, Dad, when you're preaching, is somebody speaking, is God talking in your ear? Because he would have so much to say away from his text. He started off reading real slow and low voiced, and then he would start getting off and going for another 30 minutes without his text. So I thought, as a child, somebody must be talking in my dad's ear. And I remember my dad laughing, and he said, no, he said, you build up such a repertoire of things that you just have a lot of things you can pull on. So, but Dr. King is trying to read his speech. And I can tell you right now, any black Baptist preacher that's trying to read his speech is not going to work. And you go in there and see them in these churches, and they'll start reading the text. And my dad when he did his sermons, I see a lot of them doing the same thing, would start off real low and getting their breathing right, and then when they get to a crescendo in terms of the tone, they began to go into another state or oratorical state. And my dad told me, he said that if you start off on a higher level with your volume, you become so hoarse. And so they start on real low. Okay, we're taking a break right now. I'm going to continue to talk about what we're talking about. We're going to talk about, we'll come back, and when you come back from WFOV, we won't be very far from where we were when you left. We'll see you on the other side of the break in 4 minutes. Those who are staying with us at WFOV, we're going to continue what we're talking about. I'm trying to build the climate up for today's celebration of Dr. King's life and legacy that lasted 13 years in terms of starting to be a part of the civil rights movement, which goes back, quite frankly, to the arrival of the first blacks off the Dutch ship in 1619 that arrived in Jamestown, which would be 12 years after the founding of Jamestown, which is named after the, James I, who was the King of England, don't tell me, from 1603 to 1625. And so Jamestown, founded in 1607, is named after that. Jamestown named after King James I, the first of the Stuart kings.
And the first one they named also the same king that the King James Version of the Bible is named
Thank
after.
you for that also, John. That's also true. The King James Version of the Bible, which goes back to 1611. And don't forget the version of the Bible, meaning that was King James Version, because the Bible was not written in English. Jesus did not speak English. John, they think that the King James Version of the Bible, that Jesus was back there during the time of the Aramaic language, which has gone the way of the wind, just as the hieroglyphics have in Egypt.
Except for the church I go to, the Assyrian Church of the East.
They have the Assyrian church that you go to over here on what is that, Lewis Street?
Yeah, it's Lewis and Leith. Yep.
Yeah. So, but they think that it's that the King James version of the Bible is just him writing a version. It's another translation of it from the Greek and from the Aramaic into the Greek, and then from the Greek into Latin, and later on in 1517 the German with Martin Luther, after whom Martin Luther King was in fact named. By the way, John, did you know that Martin Luther King was not named Martin Luther at birth? He was called Michael.
Michael, yeah. No, they changed it after his dad attended some kind of conference in Germany.
Yeah, they saw. You know how when you name a child, you don't know any of his attributes. You don't know if that's George or is that James or is it Michael. You don't really have anything to go by. It's just that you might have had a family member, and it might be I'm named after my grandfather. I never met him, but my dad named me. This name got me in a lot of trouble, by the way, when I was in school, because they was always kidding me about it. My name is George Washington Moss, and so when I was in school, I had to run home every day because they were picking on me for having that name. But my dad named me after his dad. His name was my dad's father was George Washington Moss. So but he didn't know if I was like his father or not. But they had to call me something, and he couldn't do like Tarzan was doing, called me boy. Although John, they did know I was a boy, because they looked down at the genitalia. Now they can't tell. They can't tell if they got a boy or a girl today because of how things have changed since that time period. But anyway, I was talking about how if King came back and he saw the conditions that he could not possibly have seen in 1968 in that I Have a Dream speech in 63, and in 68, the mountaintop speech. My question is simply this. If King could have been fortuitous enough to look down through the ages to this day and time and could have seen the result of, well, I wouldn't say the result, but just see the outcome of quote unquote his people, or the outcome of the country, and see how it's in what state is in right now. In many ways, is in a worse state now than it was when he was alive, although nobody's riding the back of the bus right now. The question that I raised, and I think that's what Magruder was getting at in terms of having King come back after being in a coma and then couldn't get the people's attention because they're out there doing the funky chicken. The question that is raised by Magruder's work in the Boondock series, and the question that I raise when I'm talking to people about King, is that if King is on that balcony that day and was prescient enough to know how this drama would end up, or how it would end up as of today, the question is King out there on that balcony willing to sacrifice his life? John, let me say this, John. The King that's on that balcony April the 4th, 1968, for the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee at 6 o'clock that evening, that King is not psychotic, because Dr. King was immersed in trying to resolve a problem both for the people in the South and also trying to resolve a problem that was historic, going back, at least as it relates to the black-white situation, going back to the arrival of the first 20 blacks in this country in 1619. They came here, by the way, not as slaves, something close to it, but not slaves. They came here as indentured servants. And the slavery itself wouldn't start until another 20, 30 years later in the 1640s in Massachusetts and so on. But King was not on the balcony willing to take a bullet for the conditions trying to resolve, which he had mentioned as much of that on the day before when Dr. King said that I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And Dr. King was saying that the possibility of his not arriving with the people in the future, he wanted a person to know that the night before he was killed, that they would get to the promised land, and this wasn't it.
Wasn't his house already firebombed and all this other stuff?
His house was firebombed.
He saw the writing on the wall. He did.
Yeah, and saw it for 13 years. You know, King was constantly talking about death. People do not know the strain, the stress and strain that King was under. And I go so far as to say this, having read Ralph Abernathy's book, which everybody should read. Should read Abernathy's book. We're reading the softback cover of the book. I have it in both the hardback, but also the softback. And if I had to recommend one of the two, I recommend the softback version, because in the softback version, Ralph Abernathy, who was Dr. King's right-hand man and his closest confidant, whom he pointed out as being that the night before his death, he said that Ralph, he said, when I was listening to Ralph introduce me, I was wondering who he was talking about, because, you know, Ralph was getting a big bill up, and King was joking about he didn't know who Ralph was talking about, you know, showing some modesty and so on. But he did say that in his introductory remarks, he said, and Ralph is the best friend I have in the world. Now, he didn't call Jesse Jackson's name out, because he and Jesse were constantly at odds with each other. And I can say a whole lot of things about what Jesse did in the aftermath of Dr. King being struck down on the Lorraine Hotel the next day, because a lot of what they've written about that Jesse was claiming, none of that stuff is true. And I can give you a book about that as well, a book called You Ought to Read about that, because Jesse Jackson is an opportunist. He was then and he is now. The book called Jesse Jackson, The Myth, the Man, and the Movement, written by Barbara Reynolds. And if you can find a copy of that book, you need to go and read it. That book came out in 1970. Another book you might want to read that gives another side of Dr. King's personality is a book written by Johnny Williams called The King That God Didn't Save, which is also a very good book, and just kind of explores a lot of different dimensions of Dr. King's personality. But here's the point I'm making about Dr. King not being psychotic on that balcony. But if he knew how this would end up, at least at this point, because we're still writing the book, this is another chapter in it. But if he could have gotten to 2019 and gotten to his 90th birthday and seen how that would be at this time, if Dr. King was on that balcony, April the 4th, 1968, willing to take a bullet for this result, Not the one that he imagined, but for the result that we now see, that we're now in this situation and in this cesspool that we're in right now, where no one is out there appreciating Dr. King's witness. Where they're out on the dance floor, if he came back trying to get their attention, it would be just like Magruder tried to describe it. Some people, one writer said that his speaking style is too slow. Dr. King was a very deliberate speaker. And the rap artists are, it's like this now. So the crescendo in which speeches are given is different today. And Dr. King would have a difficult time being listened to today as it was at that time. So if King could have looked down through history and seen how this drama ends up, at least at this point in time, not knowing what will be on the other side of this moment, but right now we are here. If Dr. King was on that balcony willing to take a bullet and would have seen, let's say in his 90th year, where we are in this country and where blacks are in this country, if King is on that balcony willing to take a bullet for this condition right here, Dr. King would have to be psychotic. And I asked the question about Malcolm X the same way. Both these men were willing to martyr themselves, and both men that knew that danger was all around them, and neither one of them thought that they would live to an old age and were willing to pay that price. King was talking about it the night before. I mean, I get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. Not if Jessica could forestall it, and not if Al Sharpton could forestall it, because what stood up in his place were these charlatans, the ones that Booker T. Washington talked about in 1911. When he said that there's a segment of Negroes who have found out they can make a living by holding the Negroes' grievances up in front of him, and they found out that they can make a living by doing that. And he said that they do not want blacks. He didn't call them blacks; he called them Negroes, because that's how they were titled at that time. Said there's the segment of Negroes who don't want the Negro to lose his grievance because they don't want to lose their job. And that's about the size of it today. None of these people out there in front of that's doing these cameo appearances, none of them are serious. Not Jesse Jackson, not Al Sharpton, not Farrakhan. These are games people are playing. And I know people think that because some voices are more militant than others, that there is some sincerity in the persons that are emoting this. And I understand people will not understand that I'm making this indictment here, because I was in the same state that they're possibly in right now. I was in that state back there in the 1970s when I talked to James Baldwin. And for those of you who don't know who James Baldwin is, James Baldwin is one of those writers that was in a timepiece in the 1960s. And everybody was reading, when I was in college, everybody was reading James Baldwin. And I had an opportunity to meet him at Oakland University when he came in from France to speak. And I asked him, back there in the mid-1970s, I asked him, what did he think about the state of black leadership? And I said, Mr. Baldwin, can I ask you a question about this? I want to ask you, what do you think about black leaders today? Because Malcolm X had died. King had died 3 years later. Malcolm X was killed on February the 21st, 1965. And then 3 years later, you had Martin Luther King killed. 2 years before Malcolm was killed, you had John F. Kennedy was killed. And here I am, a college student. I'm trying to figure out what's going on in the country. All these great people are being assassinated and killed off, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And Dr. King had lost his life, and I'm trying to get some idea of where we are at that point. So I asked James Baldwin, what did he think about black leaders? Because I didn't see them doing what King was doing. I didn't think they were sincere, but I want to get another opinion. I respected Baldwin, because of what Baldwin represented in the literary world. I was reading Baldwin's works. I read his 1964 book, The Fire Next Time, a book of essays that he dedicated to his nephew. And then some of his novels, Another Country, Nobody Knows My Name, If Beale Street Could Talk, No Name in the Street. So I respected Baldwin because of his literary prowess, and I wish I could. I was at that time. I wish I could be at the bottom of his typewriter as the pages were coming out of his typewriter. I could just fall. I would catch the pages falling down. I could read them as they came off the typewriter because I was so impressed with his writing style. And I was reading him, and I had already read the person that was kind of like his predecessor. He was a protege, pretty much, of Richard Wright. And Richard Wright's book, the one called Native Son, which was his masterpiece, and Black Boy, which was a biography, and American Hunger, which was a continuation of that. So anyway, what I'm getting at, I'm kind of going around a lot of things here, but what I'm trying to say basically is that I wanted to find out in the aftermath of King's death, what did he think about the state of black leadership in the aftermath of Dr. King, in the aftermath of Malcolm X, in the aftermath of a lot of these leaders that had been martyred in the civil rights movement, because a lot of people, Jimmy Lee Jackson, a lot of others had died in these different movements. Reverend Reed. Look at the woman down in Detroit, Vala Luozo, who was one of the person that went down to Selma, from when they marched from Selma to Montgomery. You probably remember that part of the civil rights movement when they marched on March the well, it started out, by the way, March 7th, 1965. And they went to the Edmund Pettus Bridge and got beat back because Sheriff Clark and others would not let them pass over that bridge on their way to Montgomery, 50 miles away, and they stopped them at that point. And John Lewis, you lying about that whole thing that happened in Selma. You trying to pretend that what happened on March 7th was the marching going from March 7th going to Montgomery. And that's where you would have led the march at that point. That's not really what happened. You can go and get you can fool people like that's what really took place. That's not the march. That's the one you tried to lead. And the only reason you tried to lead that march, the only reason you got a chance to lead that march is because you tricked Dr. King. Dr. King was in Atlanta, Georgia, and people had gotten energized around the civil rights movement and wanted to do something with it. So SNCC comes in, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You remember Cheney, Goodman, and let's see, Scherner, Cheney, and Goodman, the three lives for Mississippi that had been written about by William Bradford Huey in his book called Three Lives, Lives, Three Lives of Mississippi. So people have seen dogs put on children, and American people, and I have to give them credit for this. That's why you will never see me down here when they play the national anthem kneeling. I'll be standing up because I understand why King is out there in the street. You know why he's out there in the street? You know why? Who's trying to get to stand down? The politicians. This idea was the American people. It was a politician stirring that pot. So you'll never see me on my knees. The American people saw that inequality expressing itself in Montgomery, in Selma, in Birmingham, and St. Augustine, Atlanta, Georgia, and other cities in the South, and they rose up in righteous indignation against it. And they were trying to come to the aid of Dr. King and others, and raising money for them, by the way, because they saw the inequity on their television sets. It bothered the American people. So when John Lewis, who was the upstart in the SCLC. He did not create the SCLC, but he's the person that succeeded Berry, who later on become the mayor of Washington, D.C., the one over there smoking pot. That's another, I should smack these guys. Marion Barry was a chemistry student at Fisk University, and he was a part of the civil rights movement. Later on becomes a mayor of Washington, D.C. And I have to tell you something. You don't have the right to disrespect this movement in that way in which these persons did later on in the aftermath of Dr. King. Many of them just simply threw their hands up and surrendered, lost their vision, and so on and so forth. Marion Barry did that, and a lot of the others also. But John Lewis was in Selma, and Dr. King went back to his church to preach, and so did Ralph Abernathy. People are coming out of the north, and they're arriving in Selma, and they want a march to take place. They came down to witness to this demonstration. And John Lewis, the opportunist that he was, he's still an opportunist right now. Now these members of the Congress, matter go and read about that between the time that he ran for the office against Julian Bond, and how they were both part of the SNCC, called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They were in the same organization. Look at how they pitted each other, how they were pitted against each other, and what they said against each other when they ran for the same seat. Another disgrace to the civil rights movement. But Julian Bond lost, and John Lewis will become later on the representative out of Atlanta. But in '65, they got these people down there in Selma. They came down to march. They wanted to go out there and put their bodies on the line because they were outraged at how things were going in the South, how people were being treated. They saw blacks. These are whites coming out of these universities and so on. Saw blacks getting beat. They want to come down there and join that movement because of their moral outrage of this. And when they got there, King is in Atlanta, Georgia, and so is Ralph Abernathy, and they're at their respective churches about ready to go into the pulpit, which you can always time them about that because there's a certain time in which they come out and go on the stage, and they come out there a couple more songs before they are brought forward to give the speech before the service is over. Not before, by the way, they pass the basket. That's got to happen there. You never see a Baptist church meeting where the basket is not passed. I don't care what time of day it is or what time the meeting is being held. You will have that basket passed. So Dr. King getting ready to go in this pulpit, and John Lewis and Jose Williams called up Dr. King, and they say, look, we got some people here from the north, and they want to have a march, and you're not here. Can we go ahead with the march? And so King tells John Lewis, who's also glad King not there because it gives him a chance to get in the limelight, tells him, well, let me call Ralph and see what Ralph says about it. Calls Ralph up. Ralph get ready to go in his pulpit and preach his sermon for that day. And they say, both of them agree that it wouldn't be a bad idea. Nothing can happen. That's too bad in their absence. Go ahead with the march since you got all these people down there. They told King there were 6,000 people in Selma. A couple of hundred people were there. And so King didn't want to rob them of the opportunity to pay witness. He told John Lewis to go ahead. And that's when John Lewis and Jose Williams got in front of this demonstration, went to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and were told by Clark and others, the troops, to turn around and go back. And when they did not do it, on March 7th, 1965, called Bloody Sunday, that's in which many persons said it was a massacre. A lot of people got beat down. John Lewis had his head cracked open. He'd been riding it ever since. They don't talk about the fact that they had lied to King to get the march going. And then when they were leading the march, Jose Williams and John Lewis showed that they were not really prepared to be the leaders of this movement, although they had ambition to do so. They weren't really qualified to be in front of that movement. Martin Luther King was a very special leader, and they led people into an ambush, and they cracked heads and so on and so forth. Now a lot of folks going into Montgomery are going into Selma on that march, but that's not the march that John Lewis led. That march is March 7th. They don't go back to pick the march up to really go from Selma to Montgomery until 15 days later, on March 22nd, 1965. And it took them 3 days to get there, walking 50 miles. From March 22nd to March 25th. And that's when King gave another one of his talks, and that was the one about where he said, there were those who said we wouldn't get here. And others said we'd only get here over their dead bodies, but all the world can see that we are here. And they were standing before the forces of power in the state of Alabama saying we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around. Which is really, to me, one of King's greatest speeches, because it shows Dr. King's determination. But the I Have a Dream speeches is the one they play. But the strength of Dr. King doesn't come through the dream. And I agree with, I'll tell you who I agree with, this philosopher from Canada named Stefan Molyneux, who critiques the idea of having a dream. Molyneux says that's very different from saying, I have a plan. You can see that I have a dream is something out there in terms of a dreamer. A lot of children right now think Dr. King was somebody who was in bed and was sleeping and had some dream. And that's not what King was talking about. King had a dream. He said this, I have a dream is deeply, listen to Dr. King speak. Try to pay attention to this speech that he gave, because that part of the speech will last another 13 minutes. The 5 minute and 5 second part of the speech was that part he prepared. The part where he got off the text is another 13 minutes. And Dr. King said, I have a dream. It's deeply rooted in the American dream. Now you try to get out there with somebody down there on their knees, kneeling when you're playing the national anthem, and they're out there kneeling and got $2.4 million in their pocket on the average in the football league, and they're out there. I didn't see. Last night, I gotta say this. I'm a little off, but I tie this in. I was watching a football game last night. This is my first time watching football because I can't watch these fools. I can't watch these fools anymore out there in the football field. I watch college football, but my friend told me they had a quarterback that was going to be playing for what was that team he was playing for? They played the Patriots. Whatever that other team was, he was on that team. And they said this guy throws no-look passes. Well, I never heard of no-look pass in football. I hear about it in basketball, where the guy is looking over here and throwing the ball over there. They said this guy had thrown 50 touchdown passes. So I had to see this before the season was over, and I watched it last night for that reason. But I watched it after. I don't know if they've been kneeling down when they played national anthem this year or not. I don't know, because I don't watch it. But I can tell you right now, Dr. King would not support it. Dr. King said that his dream was rooted in the American dream. That's what Dr. King is trying to do. Dr. King is trying to perfect the ideals found in the documents of the United States. One of which is the document called the Declaration of Independence, the document upon which a revolution was fought in this country, where it says in the second paragraph, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, establishing their just authority from the consent of the governed. That's what King is doing. King is trying to take the ideals of the country and perfect them. He was not out there kneeling, unless he was praying. And you never have seen Dr. King out there kneeling when they played the national anthem, because King had too much respect for what he was trying to do, and would never have done that, because it corrupts the children whose idea of the country being perfected with whatever role they can play in the continuation of that would never have destroyed them at the outset. King was just like my teachers in that respect, because my teachers, I'll be honest, I was raised, I came out of Birmingham. My teachers never did tell me about all of the things wrong with the country. They didn't waste our time with that nonsense. We knew what was wrong with the country. We couldn't go to the store, couldn't go to that bathroom, couldn't use this water fountain. What they were telling us was we had to get our skills right. And I kept hearing and didn't understand why, but I kept hearing for 12 years I had to be twice as good. And that's what they were doing. They were training us to be twice as good because they were training us for the time where we could, through our own efforts, perfect the democracy. And that's in the best image and respect for what Dr. King was trying to do. Not this nonsense going on right now, because that was not what King was about. And if we're going to honor Dr. King, we need to understand Dr. King on that balcony and the vision that Dr. King had for 2019, and this is not it. You can have that on TV all day long. This is not what King was trying to do. And this is not what King stood for. And all these people in front of black people today out here that are running this noise out here, they're not telling blacks to be the best they can be inside this country as Americans in this country, are defaming Dr. King's legacy and the legacy of so many others who martyred themselves for this day to be possible. We're not doing it, folks. And you can go and celebrate Dr. King's legacy by being a great example of what Dr. King was trying to accomplish, and then to do your part. Okay, we're going to get out of here. I want to thank you for listening to my rant, and we'll see you again next week at the same time at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And we come on every Monday from 2 o'clock to 3, and we'll be back airing again this program on WFOV Saturday at Saturday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on WFOV 92.1. Until next week, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.